On March 25, 2020, deputies from the Crittenden County Sheriff's Office responded to a security alarm activated at the historic Snowden House, a colonial-style mansion on the northwestern shore of Horseshoe Lake, near Hughes, Arkansas. When they arrived, they entered the home through a back door, which had been left open. As they were clearing the house, they came across a man on the second floor. Upon seeing the deputies, the man jumped out of a window. The deputies saw the man, apparently not seriously injured despite the distance of the jump, run to a nearby vehicle and get inside of it. He then tried to drive away, but the vehicle became stuck in the mud. The man then ran towards the lake. The deputies watched as he jumped into the frigid water, but never saw him come back up to its surface. There was no other living person found in Snowden House, but the deputies did discover the bloody body of Martha Mckay, the granddaughter of the builders of the home and its current owner, wrapped in a blanket at the top of the home's grand staircase. She had been stabbed and bludgeoned to death. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission and the Crittenden County Search and Rescue Team were brought in to recover the body of Martha's presumed killer in the lake. The Game and Fish Commission successfully used sonar to locate it, and Search and Rescue was then able to pull it from the water. After his body was retrieved, Martha Mckay's murderer was identified as 39-year-old Travis Sante Lewis. His autopsy found methamphetamine, marijuana, and cocaine in his system. Both Tragedy and Travis Lewis were not strangers to the home or to Martha's family. 23 years prior to killing Martha, Travis Lewis had killed her mother, Sally Snowden Mckay, and her cousin, Joseph Lee Baker, at a home just down the shoreline from Snowden House, after the pair came upon Travis in the process of robbing Sally's home. Snowden House was originally built by Robert Bogardus Snowden II and his wife, Grace Montcastle Snowden. The Snowdens were a prominent family in Memphis, Tennessee, and Robert's father, Robert Brinkley Snowden, was heavily involved in business, banking, and real estate development throughout the greater Mid-South area. The younger Robert became fascinated with airplanes at a young age and eventually became a pilot. In 1916, while flying over eastern Arkansas in a small plane, he first saw Horseshoe Lake and the beautiful land surrounding it, some 30 miles south of Memphis. When he returned home, he told his father that he one day wanted to build a farm there. Robert then went off to serve during World War I. He had already met his future wife, Grace, at a hayride in Knoxville, Tennessee, where he was attending agricultural school at the University of Tennessee. The couple hoped to marry before Robert left for war, but Grace's mother refused to allow the marriage to occur until Robert returned home. Grace trained to be a nurse in Robert's absence, in case he returned home from the war injured. She then went on to be a well-respected nurse for the Red Cross for the remainder of the war. When Robert returned home, his father told him that he had purchased more than 10,000 acres of land in eastern Arkansas from its struggling owner. The elder Snowden allowed his son to purchase 1,000 of those acres near Horseshoe Lake. Grace and Robert married in 1919 and began the process of building a home there. The original Snowden home at Horseshoe Lake was a more modest one-story fishing cabin, propped up on brick supports with a screened-in porch the length of the front of the house. It was not until the 1940s that it was expanded into the large three-story Snowden House, modeled after colonial-style antebellum mansions more commonly found in Louisiana. Robert and Grace had 3 daughters together, Sally, Edie, and Happy. The girls spent their early childhood at the home on Horseshoe Lake, where their father farmed acres of cotton, but were eventually sent to Memphis to live with their grandparents so that they could attend school. They lived on Central Avenue in Ashlar Hall, a castle-like home their grandfather had designed and built in 1896. While Sally Snowden spent her school years in Memphis and much of her young adulthood in California, her heart remained at Horseshoe Lake. She eventually married an actor from New York named David Mckay, and they moved to San Francisco. By 1976, the couple's children were grown, and their marriage was over. Sally moved back to Memphis, where she bought a home in Midtown and opened an office for her work as a certified public accountant. However, she spent as much of her time as possible at her home in Horseshoe Lake, not far from Snowden House. While the Snowdens were the first people to build a home on the lake, and for a while were the only ones with a residence in the area, over the years a small community had sprung up around the lake, and it was continuing to expand. Sally was in charge of managing the family property in the area. Her father had created a corporation that controlled the properties he owned in the 1960s and divided shares in the company between his daughters and their children. The company controlled the house and its surrounding farmland, as well as a fishing camp, industrial property, an orchard, and 30 lakefront cabins Robert owned. Following his death in 1982, Sally had been put in charge of the corporation. She had divided up ownership of the cabins between her family and the families of her two sisters, but everyone remained joint owners in the rest of the property through their shares in the corporation. By the 1990s, much of the land was leased, including Snowden House itself, which was leased out to a family that ran a bed and breakfast and a restaurant out of it. Sally now had recreational rentals on some of the property that she also managed. She also opened a small antique store, Horseshoe Antiques, in the area around this time. Sally was high-spirited and happy. She loved to travel and was always up for an adventure. She was most comfortable in sandals and jeans. She once told her friend Karen Shea about an English lord she had met in her youth. He had wanted to marry her. When Karen asked why she hadn't accepted the proposal, Sally replied, "Oh, Karen, I just didn't want to get dressed up all the time." Everyone who lived near Horseshoe Lake knew her simply as Miss Sally, even though many of them were her tenants or employees. "I don't care if you're black, white, or whatever. If you was in trouble, if you needed help, and went to Miss Sally, you could have got it," lifelong Horseshoe Lake resident Levi Glasper said about her in 1996. Lee was like that too. He was the same way. Lee was Joseph Lee Baker, Sally Snowden Mckay's nephew. Lee was a popular Memphis area blues musician. He played guitar and regularly performed at venues on Memphis's famous Beale Street. He was in several bands over the course of his career, but was mainly playing with his band, The Agitators, by the 1990s. He had collaborated with numerous other artists on the recordings over the years. Lee and his wife Carol lived on a house near Horseshoe Lake with their 3 sons, Joe, Bo, and Ben. On August 12, 1996, the home was tragically lost to a fire, which burned so intensely that it melted the paint off of one of the fire trucks that had responded to put it out. Authorities were investigating the possibility that the fire had been the result of arson. The Bakers were therefore staying at a lakefront home just 100 yards down the road from Sally Snowden Mckay's home. On the morning of September 10, 1996, Carol Baker saw her husband exercising. He gave her a kiss and told her he will be going over to speak with his Aunt Sally about some business. He assisted her with some of the operational aspects of managing the family's properties. Later that morning, a local man named Bobby Couples came across a bright red Toyota Camry wrecked along the side of the road. The car was on its side, and its engine was still running. Bobby kept driving and stopped at a nearby boat shop to see if anyone there knew whose car it was. Levi Glasper, one of the owners of the shop, came out to see the car and identified it as belonging to Sally Snowden Mckay. Levi and Bobby immediately went to Sally's home, roughly a mile away, to check on her. When the 2 men arrived at the home, Lee Baker's white GMC Sierra was backed up against its back door. Levi, a volunteer firefighter, put the back of his hand up against one of the home's windows and could tell by the heat he felt that there was a fire inside of the home. He and Bobby had to drive back to the boat shop to call for help, but then return to the home to try to help Sally and Lee. When the fire trucks arrived, Bobby and Levi had just pulled Lee's truck away from the door using a winch. While the fire was still not visible from outside the home, flames were visible in the kitchen and living room once the door was opened. Firefighters were able to extinguish the fire within a few minutes. While the fire was quickly contained, it had caused devastating damage to the home. However, the physical damage to the property was of little concern compared to what else was found inside of it. Inside the home, firefighters discovered the badly burned bodies of Sally Snowden Mckay and Lee Baker. Sally was 75 years old, and Lee was 52. The subsequent investigation would reveal 2 disturbing details about the fire. It had been set intentionally, and it had not been what killed Sally and Lee. They had both been shot. Following his father's death, Lee's son Joe dropped out of college and went to work as a farmer. The Bakers had lost all of the photos they had of Lee and his extensive music memorabilia collection in the August fire. An appeal went out to the Memphis music community, asking for anyone with pictures of Lee to send them to his family. Sally and Lee's murders were the first in the entire history of the Horseshoe Lake community. Their neighbors were in shock and on edge, in disbelief that such a terrible crime could have occurred in their beloved community, but also fearful that the killer might strike again. They luckily did not have to wait very long for the culprit to be brought into custody. On November 5, 1996, less than 2 months after the murders, authorities made an arrest in the case. They arrested and charged Travis Sante Lewis, a 16-year-old sophomore at nearby Hughes High School, with 2 counts of capital murder. His birthday was in October, meaning that he had been just 15 years old at the time of the murders. Travis Lewis did have a minor juvenile record, with charges ranging from a curfew violation to aggravated assault. The Horseshoe Lake community was still shocked that he had committed such a heinous crime. He was described as scrawny and quiet, polite and soft-spoken. He was an above-average student at Hughes High School, where Lee Baker's son, Beau, was a year ahead of him. Travis lived with his mother, Gladys, and his younger siblings in a wood house across a bean field from Sally Snowden Mckay's home. His grandparents, who rented from Sally, lived next door. Travis's first court hearing, the day after his arrest, provided little insight into how he came to be arrested. Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Lindsay Fairley told Circuit Judge Sam Turner Jr. that police had evidence tying him to the scene. He was subsequently interviewed and has made a statement and confirms his presence at the scene, but that possible additional defendants and the possibility of additional charges prevented him from providing further information about the investigation. Crittenden County Public Defender Tom Montgomery, who was representing Travis Lewis, argued that the prosecution had not presented sufficient evidence to hold his client, and that he should be released while awaiting trial. Judge Turner disagreed, and Travis was held without bond. The exact evidence that police used to identify Travis Lewis as their suspect was not made public because the case was settled before the evidence was presented at trial. The trial was set to begin on April 7, 1998, but that morning, Travis instead pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, burglary, and theft. The 17-year-old was sentenced as an adult to 28.5 years in prison on the murder charges, and to 5 years in prison for the lesser charges. The sentences would all run concurrently. Based on what we know and the evidence that we were aware of, the family felt like this was the best resolution. Sally's niece, Dottie Jones, told the Commercial Appeal after the sentencing. The Snowden family had opposed the possible imposition of the death penalty in the case had Travis been convicted of capital murder. However, when the family was notified each time Travis Lewis became eligible for parole, every member of the family was opposed to him being released every time. There was only one family member who disagreed with this position, Sally's daughter, Martha Mckay. Martha shared her mother's love of adventure, and her kind heart and generous spirit endeared her to everyone she met. Following her mother's death, her aunt, Edie Dewey, took over management of the family corporation, and Martha returned to Memphis from the West Coast for several months to help her aunt during the stressful transition phase as she adjusted to her new responsibilities. Martha also helped with minor improvements at Snowden House after the bed and breakfast closed down. Martha had previously restored a few properties in Seattle, and after her time assisting her aunt came to a close, she began a new, larger project. She purchased a historic home, built in 1861, in Virginia City, Nevada, and renovated and restored it. Several years later, she decided she wanted to use her experience with historic preservation to restore her family's home at Horseshoe Lake. While she and her siblings were not raised in the area, they spent all of their summers with their grandparents at Snowden House, and Martha had loved the time she had spent there. By this time, Snowden House was in poor shape. Martha bought it from the family corporation, becoming its sole owner. She then spent several years restoring the property, updating it while still keeping as many of the fixtures and features as historically accurate as possible. Martha had a serious interest in sustainability, so a major project she undertook during the renovation was figuring out a way to make the home more eco-friendly and cost-efficient. Using the ancient furnace to heat the house was a $1,000 a month expense. She eventually put in a geothermal system that used water from the lake to regulate the temperature in the house. Martha's initial plan when she bought Snowden House was to use it as her personal residence, and also rent it out as an event venue. However, by the time the extensive restoration on the home was complete, the country was in the middle of a recession, and Martha lost her confidence in her business plan. She put the property up for sale, but could not find a buyer. Martha's inability to sell the house ended up being beneficial for her, as she was able to return to her original plan for the house as the economy improved. She turned the home into a successful venue for weddings and other private events, and also began renting out one of the home's bedrooms on Airbnb. Martha was a longtime Buddhist, and while she was devastated over the deaths of her mother and cousin, she felt it was important to try to forgive their killer. She also felt sympathy for him because he had been just 15 years old at the time of the murders. After Travis pled guilty to the murders, Martha reached out to him in prison. Martha's communications with Travis were also influenced by the fact that she did not necessarily believe that Travis had acted alone, and she hoped to find out any further truth about what had happened to her mother and cousin. Travis had confessed to being at Sally's home at the time she and Lee were murdered, and that he and another man had been in the process of robbing it when they were discovered by Sally and Lee. However, he maintained that this other man had actually killed them, even after he pled guilty. Based on Lindsay Fairley's statements at the initial hearing, it does appear as though authorities were investigating someone else based on Travis's initial statements to them, and believed that they might be making another arrest in the case. However, they appear to have not found evidence supporting Travis's claims of the involvement of this other person in the crime, as no other arrest was ever made. The man Travis claimed was the actual killer was found to have a solid alibi for the time of the crime. Martha, seemingly unable to believe that a 15-year-old could have perpetrated such a violent crime on his own, pressured the police to continue investigating the case, believing that there was more to the story and more people who needed to be brought to justice in the case. Martha's entire family did not support her communications with Travis and told her that they believed that nothing good would come of them. Despite the objections of her relatives, Martha visited Travis in prison, wrote him letters, and supported him being released on parole. I think that she really felt in her heart he deserved to be rehabilitated, which I think really speaks to her character after such a tragic event happened to such a close family member, Lee's son Joe Baker said following Martha's murder. I'm just beyond sad that it turned out this way for her. Travis was released on parole in 2018, 20 years after he pled guilty, and Martha continued to help with his rehabilitation. Seemingly without the knowledge of her family, Martha gave Travis a job doing odd jobs at Snowden House following his release. He lived and worked on the property with his mother, Gladys, whom Martha had employed as a housekeeper at the property for several years. Eventually, even Gladys told Martha to give up on her son, warning her to distance herself from Travis because he was reverting back to his old ways. While Martha gave Travis so much in terms of forgiveness and empathy, she finally reached her limit of how much grace she could extend to him a month before he killed her. Martha fired Travis and banned him from her property, and detailed the incident that led to her decision to do so in her diary. Martha had sold an antique chandelier for $10,000, and her buyer had paid for it in cash. Travis was present at Snowden House when Martha arrived home to stash the money before depositing it. The money then disappeared. Martha fired Travis and banned him from her property, believing he had been the one who had stolen the cash. Martha's case is closed, and her killer cannot be prosecuted because of his death. While the case is as resolved as it will ever be, there are still lingering questions. Police found a bag containing some of Martha's valuables and a bloody knife near her body. It is unclear if Martha was killed after walking in on Travis robbing her home, like her mother and cousin had been years earlier, or if Travis had come to the home to kill Martha and then decided to rob it after she was dead. The former scenario may be slightly more plausible, as Martha had the chance to set off her alarm, which would have been easier to do when she first walked into her home and saw Travis there, and more difficult to do if he had attacked her as soon as he was able to make his way into the house. Again, there is no way to be sure. What exactly transpired inside of Snowden House on March 25, 2020, will never be known beyond its terrible end result. What we do know, however, in the words of Martha's sister, Katie Hutton, is that Martha didn't deserve to be killed. She didn't deserve anything that happened to her.